On December 29, 1972, Eastern Airlines Flight 401 was scheduled to fly from New York to Miami. Just before midnight, Flight 401 was making its approach into Miami International Airport when tragedy struck. Eastern Airlines Flight 401 crashed into the Everglades at 225 miles an hour, killing 96 on board. But miraculously, 75 people survived. Up to that point, the crash of Flight 401 was the worst single aircraft crash in U.S. aviation history. However, it is what happened after the crash that has turned Flight 401 into a truly bizarre mystery. In today's episode, we will look into the ghosts of Flight 401. On December 29, 1972, the passengers and crew of Eastern Airlines Flight 401 were preparing for their routine flight from cold and windy New York City to the sunshine and warmth of Miami, Florida. The aircraft making the flight was a Lockheed L-1011 TriStar, one of the safest and most advanced commercial airliners in service at the time. At 9:11 p.m., Eastern Airlines Flight 401 took off from JFK Airport in New York for its roughly 2.5-hour flight to Miami International Airport. Veteran Captain Robert Loft was the pilot, and Albert John Stockstill, a former Air Force officer, was the co-pilot. Donald Repo was the flight engineer. Maintenance workers Angelo Dandeo and Warren Terry rounded out the crew. In addition to the flight crew, Flight 401 also had 10 flight attendants on board, and on this day carried 163 passengers. The first 2.5 hours of the flight were routine and uneventful. As the flight crew prepared the aircraft for its approach to Miami, Captain Loft announced the weather conditions to the passengers. As the flight crew made preparations to land, co-pilot John Stockstill noticed that the nose landing gear light was not on, meaning the crew couldn't be sure if the nose landing gear was properly set. The plane was put on autopilot while Captain Loft climbed down into the avionics bay to personally inspect the nose landing gear. In the meantime, the rest of the flight crew were double-checking the instruments, trying to see if perhaps it was simply the light that was malfunctioning. When suddenly, the voice cockpit recorder picks up a frightening statement made by co-pilot John Stockstill. "We did something to the altitude." The plane had been set on autopilot to fly at 2,000 feet, but somehow their altitude had dropped significantly. The very last thing heard on the cockpit voice recorder was Captain Loft's voice. "Hey, what's happening here?" At 11:43 p.m., Eastern Airlines Flight 401 crashed into the Everglades at a speed of 225 miles per hour. The left wingtip caught the ground, causing the airliner to cartwheel across the swampy marshland. The aircraft broke apart, scattering wreckage across a mile-wide area. Miraculously, 75 people survived the crash. Angelo Donadeo was the only member of the flight crew to survive. 8 of the 10 flight attendants also survived the crash, along with 66 of the 163 passengers on board. Up to that point in time, this was the worst commercial airline disaster in U.S. aviation history. The FAA immediately launched an investigation into the crash. It was later determined that the probable cause of the crash was due to the flight crew being distracted when the nose landing gear light did not come on. As the crew were attempting to determine the cause of the malfunction, the autopilot was accidentally disengaged, causing the aircraft to slowly lose altitude. By the time they realized what was happening, it was too late. In an ironic twist of fate, it was found that the landing gear was functioning properly, and it was merely a burned out bulb that caused the landing gear indicator light to not come on. The official NTSB report stated, "Preoccupation with a malfunction of the nose landing gear position indicating system distracted the crew's attention from the instruments and allowed the descent to go unnoticed." As tragic and horrific as the events of December 29, 1972 were, the events that have transpired since the crash of Eastern Airlines Flight 401 are truly mysterious and terrifying. In February of 1973, a man boarded an Eastern Airlines flight out of Charlotte, North Carolina. As the man took his seat next to the window, he was pleased to see that the rest of his row was empty. As the plane rolled out of the gate, the man was staring at other planes landing and taking off out of his window. When the man looked back towards the aisle, he noticed that a pilot in full airline gear was now sitting in the previously empty aisle seat. The man just figured that it was a deadheading pilot. Deadheading is a term used to describe airline employees being shuttled from one airport to another while working for the airline. A few moments later, the stewardess noticed the pilot and began walking towards him. Before she could utter a word, the pilot disappeared before her eyes. With a confused look on her face, she looked over to the man in the window seat, and he confirmed that he too saw the pilot disappear. After looking at photos, the stewardess identified the pilot as Captain Robert Loft, the pilot of Eastern Airlines Flight 401. On another occasion, the flight crew boarded their plane in preparation for their flight from New York to Miami. When they opened the cockpit door, they saw a pilot sitting in the captain's chair. The pilot smiled and introduced himself as Robert Loft. As the crew chatted with the pilot for a bit, the pilot disappeared before their eyes. The crew was so upset by this encounter that their flight was canceled. During a flight from Atlanta to Miami, the flight crew heard a strange knocking noise coming from the avionics bay under the cockpit. When the crew opened the hatch to investigate, they were shocked to see the face of flight engineer Donald Repo staring back at them. A few moments later, the face faded away. On another occasion, a co-pilot saw Donald Repo, who informed the co-pilot that he had already done the pre-flight inspection check and then vanished before the co-pilot's eyes. During a flight from Mexico City to New York, a stewardess who was working in the galley saw the reflection of Donald Repo's face in the oven door, and she heard him say, "Beware of fire," before the reflection disappeared. As the plane reached cruising altitude, one of the engines caught fire, forcing the plane to return to Mexico City. Fortunately, the plane landed safely. Sightings of dead Flight 401 crew members had become so common that an article was published about them in a 1974 U.S. Flight Safety Foundation newsletter. In the months following the crash of Eastern Airlines Flight 401, more than 20 incidents of encounters with ghosts from Flight 401 were reported. Many have theorized that parts that had been salvaged from Flight 401's wreckage and ending up being used on other Eastern Airline L-1011s were the cause of the mysterious hauntings. The story of ghosts from Flight 401 had gotten so big that it became a best-selling nonfiction novel, been turned into a feature-length motion picture, and even into a popular song performed by Bob Welch. In an effort to put an end to all of this, Eastern Airlines was said to have removed all logbooks with reported ghost sightings and warned their employees that anyone reporting such sightings could face dismissal. Chief Executive Officer of Eastern Airlines, Frank Borman, issued a statement saying that the ghost sightings were nonsense. He also insisted that no parts were ever salvaged and reused from Flight 401. Eastern Airlines PR Director Jim Ashcock said that the airline has never hidden any of the logs or threatened any employees for reporting ghost sightings. However, many still insist that salvaged parts from Flight 401 were used in other aircraft and that Eastern Airlines had them removed and disposed of in order to put a stop to the ghostly visitations. In any case, the reports of paranormal encounters stopped after 1974. Were there really sightings of ghosts from Flight 401, or is this all nonsense, as stated by Eastern Airlines CEO Frank Borman? Whichever is the case, the ghosts of Flight 401 remains as one of the biggest paranormal mysteries of modern aviation. This concludes today's episode of the Paranormal Report. If you enjoyed today's episode, please give us a thumbs up and consider subscribing to our channel. The team at the Paranormal Report really appreciates your support.